and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We are broadcasting live today from Farmington, New Mexico, and that is the Passion Radio Network, KPCL, KTGW, and others. We're going to get into some aspects of that in just a few minutes as well. And, of course, we have a regular scheduled guest, which we'll get to in just a minute. But, of course, last night was elections in a number of parts of the United States. It was, frankly, a big Democratic night. Whether you look at what happened in Virginia, Abigail Spanberg wins, as well as being able to carry Jay Jones, the Attorney General candidate, over the line. And then, of course, you go to New Jersey. Mickey Sherrill wins in New Jersey. These were really, if you will, uphill races for Republicans, but nevertheless, this would be the attempt by Democratic leaders to point to the fact that they are beginning to win in some of these states, and this might bode well for the midterms next year and, of course, for a presidential election 3 years from now. We also might just mention a couple of other things that probably are more significant. First, of course, in New York City, as you no doubt have heard, Zohan Mamdani won comfortably a three-way race as mayor, and as we have been talking about for many days and even weeks, the impact that this could have could be very significant in terms of the fact that it's the largest city and really the center of international capitalism, the free market, and an individual who certainly does not agree with many of those ideas. So we will get into more of that in the next hour. And for our listeners in California, Proposition 50 did relatively well as well, because of this was oftentimes referred to as Gavin Newsom's redistricting referendum. As we've said on the program before, we don't like gerrymandering, even less like the idea of doing mid-decade gerrymandering, so we'll see how that unfolds as well. These are topics we will certainly get back to, and I think you will certainly want to hear as we get into some of these in the second hour. But we had scheduled, and I think it is very apropos that we do have scheduled, a conversation on this new book, How Should Christians Think About Israel? I have posted information about this book by our good friend Dr. Michael Rydelnik, I should say, and also we have posted an article by Michael Brown, The Truth About Christian Zionism. And if you have been paying attention and perhaps heard us talk about this last Friday in terms of the fact that Nick Fuentes was on the show with Tucker Carlson, and then the pushback to that interview, also the reaction to some of the reaction to the pushback that came from the Heritage Foundation, we certainly have a lot to cover, but a lot of it gets back to a fundamental question, and that is, should Christians really support Jewish people and the nation of Israel? I will point you to the Michael Brown piece where he raises two questions about, first of all, is Christian Zionism oxymoron? Is Christian Zionism a heresy? But I first of all want to spend some time in this very good book, very readable book, and relatively short for those of you that are looking for something that would maybe, as it says, a quick guide to God's covenants, biblical prophecy, and Jewish people. We welcome back to the microphone Dr. Michael Rydelnik. He is has been in the past the Vice President, Academic Dean, also Professor of Jewish Studies and Bible at Moody Bible Institute, has retired from that role. Nevertheless, you are familiar, if you've ever listened to Moody Broadcasting's Open Line with Dr. Michael Rydelnik, answering Bible questions heard on more than 300 radio stations. A son of Holocaust survivors, an individual that was raised in an observant Jewish home, and an individual that brings so much to our conversation here about Israel and about Jewish people in general. So, Dr. Rydelnik, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Listen, we
And I'm
can
glad
talk about why
got
you
that article, by
decided
the
to
way.
write this book, because one of the things that I think is interesting is when you are dealing with Christian students, or when you're out speaking and you tell a story of speaking on a group where there was a Christian college professor who started out with the statement that really, if you think about it, Israel's a quirk of history, really denying all of that. It does seem that the younger you are in the Christian world, the more likely you are to not necessarily be a friend of Israel, and even more likely you are to maybe accept some of the ideas that have been identified as anti-Semitism. And in some respects, that's why you wrote the book, isn't it?
Yeah, it was actually right after Senator Cruz was on Tucker Carlson's radio program. And Tucker didn't have any trouble going after Senator Cruz's view. You know, he people he agrees with, he gets very soft interviews. He very harsh, very aggressive, and it was actually Moody Publishers came to me, and I was working on another book for them, and they said, "Could you produce a quick book?" And I said, "Well, how quick?" They said, "In a month, because we want to get this out." Little did they know that it would be at a time when it's even more necessary now, because of the way people are kind of changing their attitude about Jewish people in general and about the state of Israel. And so that's why I wrote it. I just a good reason for having written it. I was speaking at a Moody Bible Institute conference, and of course, we know where Moody stands on these issues. I was speaking there last week, and the people who came from all over the country to this, I was speaking on Are We in the Last Days? That was the topic assigned to me. And when I talked about the rebirth of Israel and things like that, so many of the attendees, I'm not talking about people at Moody, but people attending this conference, not only challenged the idea that God has a plan for Israel and that God is working there, but challenged the idea that the Abrahamic covenant and God's promises to Israel are still functional, that the promises have not been transferred to the church. I was just flabbergasted with charges that Israel murders and are behind every bad event in the world. People were saying things like, well, the Mossad did that. I was just amazed, because that's our constituency historically. People who come to conferences at Moody are very supportive of Israel. And yet I saw a distinct change, and it made me happier all the more for the position that Moody Bible Institute has taken, and also Moody Publishers, and saying, let's get this book out. We need it. We need it more than ever.
Again, as probably some of our listeners might suspect, oftentimes we schedule individuals ahead of time, so I give high praise to my producer, Steve Miller, who I guess just in the providence of God, but maybe even understanding this, knew that you would have an interview that Tucker Carlson would do with Nick Fuentes, and also, of course, you talked about the one that he did with, of course, Ted Cruz. We're going to talk about a few others that certainly we'll talk about Daryl Cooper and some others, and we have become aware of this, and I might just mention, Michael, that on our Friday weekend edition, we said, look, we don't always want to pick a fight in the church, but it seems to me that right now we are just trying to see so many different voices coming in, and of course, I don't want to make Tucker Carlson the only puppet that we begin to attack or criticize, because again, as I said on Friday, you can find on our website probably 24 articles that we've quoted him positively, but that's a concern, and you can go back to a variety of other voices we'll talk about that have been saying the same kind of thing. So we're going to come back and talk about how should Christians think about Israel. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A recent YouTube video describes a pattern in history that has destroyed 3 global superpowers in the last 500 years. They were Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Today, the U.S. is following a similar pattern. In 1590, Spain was the richest empire on earth. Spain controlled half the world's gold and silver. Spain's military dominated Europe, and their currency was accepted everywhere, yet within 80 years the Spanish government was bankrupt. In 1914, Britain ruled the largest empire in human history. At the time, it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency, yet within 40 years the empire was gone and the currency collapsed. In 1991, the Soviet Union still seemed dominant. It was another superpower. It had nuclear weapons, global influence, and satellites spanning the globe. Yet the Soviet Union ceased to exist 900 days later due to an economic implosion. The idea that nations follow a pattern as they collapse isn't new. Decades ago, I did a week of radio programs on the decline of a nation. A decade later, I did another week on when nations die because of a book that was published with that title. Recently, I produced a booklet, A Biblical View on Historical Cycles. What is new is how this video explains the 7 stages of collapse and applies them to previous empires. But the key point of the video is the reality that America has already completed 5 of the 7 stages. We aren't approaching the pattern, we're within it. As I often suggest, we can resolve some of these issues, but the first step is to admit that we are following this pattern of collapse. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Broadcasting today from Farmington, New Mexico, the Passion Radio Network, and we are privileged to have with us for the rest of the hour Dr. Michael Rydelnik. And if you have comments or questions, feel free to give us a call. We might open up the phones a little bit later. And next hour, we'll get into some of the issues in the news. Also, of course, be talking about the election last night and what that might mean for the future, plus a couple other articles. And we also plan to do an interview with the general manager here at the Passion Radio Network. So we've got a lot of things happening. But, Michael, let me come to you, because one of the reasons I wanted to post the piece by Michael Brown is to help people understand that there are lots of different people looking at this. And of course, his Jewish background, he gets into this issue of Christian Zionism. But if nothing else, maybe that is why you early on took a moment to try to define some terms. Because when we talk about Israel, when we talk about Zionism, sometimes those have been, I think, intentionally misdefined, and he who can define the terms oftentimes can win the debate. So clarify that when we talk about things like the belief that indeed Jesus is going to return, where? Jerusalem, that there is a covenant with the Jews. Can you kind of give us an overview, first of all, of some of the definitions that we need to understand?
Sure. I think, first of all, we need to understand Jewish people. What does it mean by Jewish? Because people keep saying, oh, well, the Jewish people today aren't related to the people of the Bible, the Jewish people of the Bible. There's a whole history of how that term came about from Judah, Yehudi, Jew, and the merger of both the people from the 10 northern tribes and the southern 2 tribes that, in the diaspora became known as Jews from Judah. That's where it comes from. And it's the very same people. I think that one of the strangest things I've heard is that, oh, these Jewish people that you see today, they're not even related to the biblical Jewish people, that it was some Khazari kingdom near Ukraine that adopted Christianity, Judaism, adopted Judaism, and they are the Jews people that we see today. They've got nothing to do with biblical Israel. That is absolutely false. Genetic studies have proven it to be completely and utterly false. It's just a propaganda piece that people are throwing out there. So those are the Jewish people that we see today. They're still the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the covenant that God made with them pertains to these very same Jewish people. The other term that I think is so crucial to understand is Zion. Zion comes from the word for Jerusalem. It was an ancient term for Jerusalem in the Bible. It came to be the word that became the foundation for Zionism, which is just the belief. There's nothing nefarious about it. It's the belief that Jewish people can exercise self-determination in their own homeland, their own ancient homeland. It's the ultimate example of anti-colonialism. It's a return of the indigenous people to their ancient homeland. That's all it is. And so when people say, I am not a Zionist, I once had a wonderful evangelical preacher say, well, I'm no Zionist, but I think Israel needs to exist. I said, that makes you a Zionist. That's it's a Jewish state. That's what it is. So, but as you say, people define it in some sort of nefarious way. And of course, there's nothing further from the truth. So
yes, and sometimes they'll try to make a distinction between being anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. We'll get to that in just a minute. But you mentioned probably one of the key other words, and that's covenant. And we need to go back to Genesis 12 and other passages. And to be fair, Ted Cruz, who I've known, and of course I've known his father even more so, doesn't spend a lot of time talking about this. So when he's being asked by Tucker Carlson about, well, what does the Bible say? Maybe you can give a better explanation for what indeed we find in Genesis 12, but also that we find in many other passages that help us understand this idea of God's covenant.
Yeah, I think that's so funny that, Senator Cruz is a great constitutional lawyer and not a great biblical scholar. And so when Tucker challenged him, where does it say that I will bless those that bless you? I think that Senator Cruz was left stammering, unfortunately. But Tucker then quoted the wrong passage, too. The point is Genesis 12 promises Israel land. This is for Abraham. It's repeated to Isaac and to Jacob. Land, seed, and blessing. And the blessing aspect is that God would bless Abraham personally. He would bless the descendants of Abraham. And also, he would bless the world through Abraham. And this is what's so crucial, the idea of God says, I will bless those who bless you, curse the one who curses you. And that verse is repeated with Jacob. It's repeated with the whole people of Israel. The idea that God is going to bring blessing, and anyone that thinks lightly of Israel or condemns or curses Israel, they're going to face consequences. I listened to your commentary. I'm guessing you're thinking about when you talked about what is it about that ultimately caused Spain to collapse? What caused the British Empire to collapse? And then you followed that, and the Russian, the Soviet Union. It was all when they turned on their Jewish communities. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the factors, because it's blessing for blessing and curse for curse. And the very curses that those nations turned on the Jewish people, the result of it was that God withdrew their authority, their power, their influence. Is that where you were heading with your commentary?
Well, of course, on the commentary that many of the stations, but not all here, we were just talking about some of the economic issues, but I'm going to come back and just as you mentioned, maybe when I do a future commentary, talk about that, because the sad history of what has happened to nations that have turned against the Jews is well documented as well. The one that you heard just at the break, which some of the listeners heard, has to do with the economic issues. But back to the covenant, I mean, again, I want just one more thing, because you do spend a fair amount of time in this one chapter on not only the Abrahamic covenant, but the land covenant, the Davidic covenant, and you give us many verses taking us all the way up to the new covenant. So there is maybe an assumption on the part of people who've never really had this taught in the church, or never gone to a Bible school where this is taught. They think, well, we got Genesis 12, but that's Old Testament, doesn't have anything to do with the New Testament. That's why I also posted the piece by Michael Brown where he takes you into the book of Romans and a variety of other passages, because in some respects we need to teach some of this, don't we?
Yeah, I think that unfortunately people don't know that it's not just an Old Testament promise. It's so interesting to me that in Romans 9, when Paul talks about unbelieving Israel and how he wishes he could be that he himself could be accursed if they could only be saved. He says they are Israelites. This is Romans 9:4, and to them belong, and it's a present tense there. Thomas Schreiner, who is probably not in the same theological camp as I am, fine New Testament scholar, he emphasizes that the verb that governs these two verses here is a present tense verb. And so when it says what belongs to the Jewish people is the adoption, Israel my son, the glory, the covenants. There it is. It's not like those covenants have been taken away from Israel. The giving of the law, the temple service, the promises, including the promise of the Messiah, and the ancestors are theirs, and from them, by physical descent, came the Messiah. But I think it's so crucial to understand that when God makes the new covenant, for example, which is crucial for believers today, it's made with Israel and Judah. It's made with the Jewish people. I believe that's why Romans 11 uses that figure of an olive tree where Gentiles are grafted in, contrary to nature, into the new covenant promises. Why? Because the covenant promises were made with Israel. So I think it's so crucial to grasp that. Of course, Jewish people say, well, are you saying Jewish people don't need to believe in Jesus to be saved? No, the covenant doesn't say that at all. The covenant promises that the land, the seed, the blessing will be the Jewish people's. But how is it that you experience the benefits of the new covenant and experience forgiveness through Jesus? It's only by conscious faith in Jesus. Yes. And of course, that's why we proclaim the gospel to everyone, including Jewish people. But we dare not become ignorant or arrogant toward those natural branches, the Jewish people, the way Paul describes it in Romans 11. We can't be ignorant that God's going to do something special with this people because he will his covenant.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, let's take on some of those issues because there has been a redefinition. And since we were just in Romans 9, let's go back in just a minute. When we come back from the break, Romans 9:6 talks about Israel, but some will say it's spiritual Israel. And so oftentimes you have what you call the identity theft. And so we'll talk about how some of that has been redefined. And again, this is all part of this new book, and we have information about it. It's very easy to read, and I think you should get a copy. How Should Christians Think About Israel? It's published by our good friends at Moody Press. We'll take a break and continue our conversation with Dr. Michael Rydelnik right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Broadcasting again from New Mexico, Farmington, New Mexico Passion Radio Network. And a little bit later we'll talk more about that, but we are privileged to have with us for the rest of this hour Dr. Michael Rydelnik. How should Christians think about Israel? And some very important questions. Should Christians support the modern state of Israel? How should we view Israel, the Jewish people, and the church? And what makes Israel so special? Those are very important issues. We have a link to Moody Publishers, and you can get the book in paperback or ebook. It is very inexpensive. It is very short. It is very readable. So I just think if you could take the time to find it. But if not, we also have posted a very good article by Michael Brown, The Truth About Christian Zionism. And I love that piece as well, Michael, because he not only answers a question about Christian Zionism, but then takes some time to counter this idea that, well, this is a new teaching, and gives you quotes from Augustine and Jerome. A little bit later gives you quotes from John Owen and Crease Mather, some of the Puritans, and an Anglican bishop, J.C. Ryle, and some others. And so that's important. But let's get to that one. Since you were in the book of Romans, I understand, and I do consider individuals believers, but nevertheless I disagree with them on the fact that they say, well, when I read Romans chapter 9, especially 9:6, when it talks about Israel there, it's spiritual Israel, and that's really the church. How do you respond?
Well, I think it's really important to recognize that the word Israel is used 73 times in the New Testament, and 71, there's no dispute, it's always referring to ethnic Israel, Jewish people. It's always 71 out of 73, and there's only two verses where people challenge the idea that it's referring to ethnic Israel, some sort of ethnic Jewish person, and that is, first of all, in Romans 9:6. And I think it's so interesting because what the verse actually says is, it's not as though the word of God is veiled, for not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. It's saying that not all who descended from Israel, meaning every Jewish person, is completely or totally or the most Israel, I think is really what it's saying. So what they're talking about, this true Israel, well, it's talking about Jewish believers, Jewish followers of Jesus. It's not as though the word of God has failed. Every Jewish person hasn't rejected him. In fact, there are some Jewish people who believe. Not every Jewish person by far, but there are some, like myself, speaking to you. And that's what it's talking about. Now you think, you're just saying that because you want to defend the idea that it's ethnic Israel, even in this verse. Well, truth to tell, the vast majority of scholars who don't even hold to the kind of theological perspective that I would about Israel would say, yeah, that's really talking about Jewish believers there. It's another reference to ethnic Israel. And, I mean, there are great, great New Testament scholars that concur with that. And that's what Paul's point is. The way I kind of think of it is that who is the truest Israel? Not just one who's by physical descent Israel, but someone who's by spiritual descent, believing in the Jewish Messiah. That's the truest Israel. I used to joke around with Moody students, if you're going to be a real, true Moody student, you won't just pass this course. You're going to do all the reading, 100% of the reading. True Moody student does 100% of the reading. Well, I'd always at the end of the semester ask, how many of you did all the reading? I did 95%, 50%, 70%. It was kind of interesting. So are they Moody students still? Yes, of course. But they're not the truest Moody students. They didn't do 100% of it. And that's sort of the idea there. The truest Israel are those who believe in the Jewish Messiah, Jesus.
One other one, and of course you go into this in some depth, and I would encourage people to read that, but for example, in Galatians, it talks about the fact that we're all one in Christ, and also they'll sometimes take Galatians 6:16, for example.
That's the other one.
Suggests that Israel and the church are now one. And so just a quick answer to that one, because then I want to get into, should we support Israel? And that's a bigger issue.
Yeah, that's a bigger issue. The Galatians 6:16 verse, where it talks about peace and mercy to all who agree with Paul's teaching, and especially or even and on the Israel of God. Some people want to say even the Israel of God. And the point of it is to say, he's defining those who agree with Paul's teaching. Any true believer is the Israel of God. But that's really not what's happening there. I think you and I may have studied under S. Lewis Johnson back in the day. He makes the point that the simplest grammatical explanation is always the best, and that the word there is and upon the Israel of God. It's and in addition. What's he doing? He's saying, look, I've been really coming hard on these Jewish legalists who've been saying that Gentiles need to be converted to Judaism before they can believe in Jesus. That's the problem in Galatians. I've been coming hard on them, and I've been saying, no, it's just justification by faith. And now peace and mercy to all who agree with me. And also on the Israel of God, there are many Jewish believers who agree with Paul, and he wants a special blessing for them to make it really clear that he's not attacking all Jewish believers, only those ones with that wrong teaching. And he gives a special blessing upon the Israel of God, using that simple conjunction there. In addition, upon the Israel of God. Once again, using that term to refer to Jewish believers.
Just a good hermeneutical principle, interpretive principle, and that is the KISS principle. The simplest is usually the best, and in almost always
true.
That is the case. Okay, let's get into the bigger issue. And, I'm thinking of some of the friends of ministry we have, like Joel Rosenberg and Mike Huckabee and others. They oftentimes, when they're in Israel, will say the evangelical Christians really support the nation of Israel, and they support the Jewish people. But, Michael, that's starting to change, and that's why you wrote a chapter on why Christians should care about Israel and the Jewish people. Can you explain?
Yeah, well, I do want to say this, that people are saying that do we have to support the state of Israel? The government of Israel? Is that what we're saying? Well, no, I don't think anyone is saying that every person has to agree with every decision or every aspect of the current cabinet and government of Israel. No one has ever said that. Truth to tell, I have relatives that live in Israel, and they don't like their government, but they love Israel. I've noted Americans don't always agree with their government, but they still love America. And I think the same thing is true. We don't have to agree with every policy, but we have to still stand with the state, the nation of Israel. And here's what I would say, particularly, and this is important, I think. How can we disagree with Israel? When does it move from disagreement to anti-Israel or anti-Semitism even? Here's what we can do. We have to disagree without delegitimizing Israel. In other words, without saying that there shouldn't be a Jewish state. Secondly, we can disagree, but we can't apply double standards. Expect Israel to fight a war in a way that no other Western democracy has ever fought a war. That's one of the things that's happening now because of, and sadly, there are civilian casualties, but Israel has done so much to mitigate those casualties, and yet people are saying, oh, look, there's civilian casualties, there should never be any. Well, that's just not possible. We can't apply these double standards and ignore, for example, the suffering of Christians in Africa right now. So that's the second. We can't delegitimize. We can't apply double standards. Thirdly, and I think this is imperative, that we can't demonize Israel. I was hearing from all these people. Now, I may not always agree with the Prime Minister of Israel, but certainly, he's a politician. We know politicians aren't always perfect. Are we surprised? But he's not utter evil. He's not the sum of all wickedness, which is the way people have been presenting him. And it's shocking to me that people are doing that. And making Israel this. This is one of the things I've been hearing in these interviews with some people on radio and TV. Oh, Israel is like this evil nation. We can't demonize Israel. And then lastly, and this is important, we can't operate based on deceit. We can't disagree with Israel because of falsehoods. For example, that Israel is deliberately targeting civilians, which is something I heard, that Israel is looking to persecute Christians and deliberately killing Christians in Gaza. Those are some of the things that I've actually heard. And it's just not true. And so we have to be careful not to fall prey to the false pictures, the false stories. And so can we disagree? Yes. But not.
Let me take a break, and then when we come back, we'll get into some other comments, because I think I'll open up the phones, too, if you'd like to join the conversation. 1-800-351-1212. 1-800-351-1212. We're privileged to have with us Dr. Michael Rydelnik. And, again, the book is entitled How Should Christians Think About Israel? It is a quick guide to God's covenants, biblical prophecy, and the Jewish people. And we're going to take some time just to take a break, and then we'll come back. And if you have a question, that is fine. If not, certainly we will finish off this conversation today. It's very important, very relevant, and I'm so glad the book is out. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Dr. Michael Rydelnik, and of course I'm at a radio station here where they've of course had a chance to hear him on open line as well. Let me encourage you to listen to him, to go to his website, which we have information about and all sorts of other things we'll talk about. But I thought, just as you were winding down, Michael, you were talking about, look, just because we support the nation of Israel doesn't mean that we support everything that Benjamin Netanyahu calls for, everything that the IDF does for. And in some respects, that's another argument, because the other day, Kevin Roberts, who again we have very respect for, he's president of Heritage Foundation, does this video in which he's supporting Tucker Carlson, and he starts out with what I would consider to be sort of straw man kind of statements, and that is, just because we support Israel Israel doesn't mean we agree with everything Israel does. But now that's becoming another kind of excuse. We can be as critical as we want about Israel, and at the end never come back and say, even though we may be critical of the policies, we still support Israel. I never hear the second part, and so that's another, if you weigh, a sort of talking point that has been developed.
Sure.
Haven't you noticed?
Yeah. It's like, if I disagree with Israel, that doesn't mean I'm anti-Semitic. Well, I agree. That doesn't mean you're anti-Semitic. However, it's the way we disagree. I would say, when I disagree and say, and I have disagreed about certain policies. I don't have any issue with that, disagreeing, but it doesn't delegitimize the existence of the country. It's not like I doubt that there should be a Jewish state. I certainly would not believe the lies that are being spouted about Israel. I mean, all you have to do is open the newspaper and you see these lies of deliberate genocide. There's no genocide happening. You see the lies of deliberate starvation and famine. That's been proven to be false. All these things that you hear that sadly people who profess Christ are saying, and they're saying, but I'm not anti-Semitic. Well, if you're rehashing these lies, that is anti-Semitism. And by the way, I'm trying to get away from the word anti-Semitism. My son, a Moody grad and an Israeli, he said, you know what? Anti-Semitism was a German anti-Semite, hater of Jewish people who wanted to make it sound a little bit more scientific. So he turned the words Jew hatred to anti-Semitism to make it sound scientific. He said, I think we need to go back to the term Jew hatred. And I think he may be right. So we understand it's not this cleaned up thing. It's vile, and it's something that God hates, and it's something that believers should be the foremost at the front of the line, standing against, not contributing to.
Sure. Well, let me use the word just once because I'm going to quote Barry Weiss, who wrote the book How to Fight Anti-Semitism. Now, she theologically would disagree with us, politically would disagree with us on a lot of things, as at CBS, used to be at New York Times. But she wrote a book, which I still recommend for many people, How to Fight Anti-Semitism. But it is interesting, Michael, that when she wrote that, she tried to find some examples. And, of course, we met Nick Fuentes and some of the various Nazi groups out there on the right, but she was really concerned more and wrote that because of all the resident anti-Semitism on the left, because most of these people that are anti-Semitic, that have so-called right-wing views, they're pretty obscure. But unfortunately, a lot of the people that are anti-Semitic are members of Congress, they're significant leaders, and so it's a reminder that both left and right need to clean house and need to clarify, need to say the right things, need to speak out. Clean house maybe is an overstatement, but in some respects, we can at least applaud you and many other people that have spoken out about what's going on the right. But I'm appalled, and I suspect you are as well, of all the things that people are allowed to get away with on the left that are anti-Semitic ideas.
Yeah, but I think that there's a serious problem when Nancy Pelosi tried to deal with the anti-Semitic statements of Ilhan Omar. She was just shot down. She wasn't allowed to really do it. Happily, I've been hearing some outstanding leaders on the right who are addressing the platforming of this Nick Fuentes character. And I appreciate that there's an attempt happening right now on the right to do what William Buckley did back in the day when anti-Semitism was creeping into the right wing. He basically made it unwelcome. I do think if you're going to recommend an article, I'm not sure. I think it was on Barry Weiss's old website. Or no, it's at the Hoover Institution. Victor Davis Hanson has just written an article called The New Anti-Semitism. And one of the things that he mentions in this is that this article I read by him, he says that the right anti-Semitism is basically making common cause with the left, that they're saying the same things. It's the old horseshoe principle. that the one place where the extremes can agree is on the extremes. They come together, the extreme left, extreme right. I think that's what's happened. The difference, I would say, hoping, this is what kind of hopeful for me, that the right will actually police it and keep it on the extreme and not let it move to the mainstream, unlike what's happened on the left, where it has come into the mainstream because there was no policing of it. So
let me just mention real quickly, I looked it up here, Victor Davis Hanson, The New Anti-Semitism. I'll post that. Matter of fact, I might just post it later in the week because we can read it and then maybe spend some time talking about that because, again, you're seeing Breakpoint commentary speaking on this. Jim Dennison, who is a friend of the ministry, has written about this. This has come at a time in which many people are speaking out, but one of the reasons why I am just delighted that you have written this booklet, or book, however you want to describe it, is how should Christians think about Israel, is that it comes at such an appropriate time. It's one thing to speak out, it's another to give very positive arguments, which you do, and if nothing else, we are just delighted that you wrote the book, and we're delighted that you could be on the program with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm passionate about this. I think that we're at a critical juncture in our nation right now and in the church. And I'm hoping that this will help everyday people in the church to read this and get a biblical perspective about Jewish people, not politics, not history, but biblical, to think biblically about the Jewish people and have it affect our lives, and to pray for the peace of Jerusalem and to have a passion to be on God's side, to bless Israel and the Jewish people, not to condemn or to curse.
Well, Michael, it's always just a delight to have you on the program. I'm a loyal listener and a great individual that appreciates all that you say and do, and so thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Let me just mention that we do have this article by Michael Brown, The Truth About Christian Zionism. I just mentioned it in passing, so there would be something that you could download right now and read. I just noticed that the Victor Davis Hanson article is on the Free Press. Well, since I've subscribed, I can get it and probably just post it later in the week, because if you try to read it, you're certainly welcome to do so. It's Victor Davis Hanson, The New Anti-Semitism, Free Press. Unless you're a subscriber, you might only get to read the first 3 paragraphs. So we'll see what we can do to set that up so that you can read it. And this will not be the last time. I guarantee we will not stop talking about Israel, not talk about anti-Semitism. And in fact, we have booklets both on Israel and anti-Semitism, which are available, of course, as you might expect, at pointofview.net. Let's take a break, though. We have a lot to cover in the second hour, so I hope that you will take the time to visit the website, find some of the articles we've posted, and when we come back, we'll talk about the election. We'll get a chance to talk with the general manager here at Passion Radio Network and bring a couple other news stories to you that you probably will hear only here on Point of View. We'll be right back.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up, but we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today as we broadcast again from Farmington, New Mexico, and we're just so grateful for the wonderful hospitality we received here. In just a few minutes, we'll have a chance to talk with the manager of Passion Radio Network, but I thought for just a few minutes we will reflect on the election last night. And first of all, I think it is important to recognize that it was a big night for the Democratic Party. That being said, there is a real mistake that people make sometimes by trying to extrapolate and say, well, with these victories that took place in 2025, we can expect even more victories in 2026 with the midterms. Let's face it, this was an uphill battle in places like New Jersey and Virginia. As a matter of fact, even the fact that the New Jersey race was competitive perhaps told us a little bit about the fact that there are individuals that maybe do wonder what is going to be the future of the Democratic Party, because both of these victorious governors really, in a sense, ran away from Zohan Mamdani. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. You might remember, wasn't it, I think, Abigail Spanberger, who was in Congress, saying we have got to stop talking about socialism after the midterm disaster that happened before. So these are individuals that are still recognizing that there's a real division right now within the Democratic Party between, for example, the newly elected mayor of New York City, as well as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and many others. So we will see where this goes, but let me just do a little bit of evaluation for just a minute. And that is, first of all, let's go to Virginia. And Abigail Spanberg won, and this, I think, in some respects, wasn't too surprising, because many people thought that the Republican candidate, who I think very highly of, by the way, Winsome Earl Sears, was maybe underfunded and maybe was a relatively underwhelming campaign. And so you have, of course, the fact that this may not be a completely blue state, but at least you would call it a purple state. And because of that, that was a little bit of a challenge. And I think it's a real struggle when you realize, as we've pointed out before, some of the things that the current governor has done there, and maybe those will not continue. So I can get into all those details, and probably we will on our Friday weekend edition. But nevertheless, this was an attempt to see if they could get a victory for the Republican candidate, and it was a victory for the Democratic candidate. As I mentioned just a minute ago, when you deal with New Jersey, Mickey Sherrill won, and the fact that the Republican candidate, Jack Ciattarelli, was even keeping it that close, I think shows that even though we assume that a lot of states like New Jersey are blue states, it's always a possibility that something will change. Now, let's, before I get to what's happened out there in California or New York City, point out that when you look at these very few races, and they're very few, and so it's probably important not to extrapolate too much, Donald Trump, as you might imagine, weighed in by saying, well, the reason this happened is because I was not on the ballot.
Well, if you accept that, and I don't accept it completely, but I recognize that certainly whoever's at the top of the ticket sometimes helps a little bit and sometimes a lot, and that was the case. This was, if anything, a warning that will Republicans be able to turn out votes in other elections, say the midterm elections this time next year, without Donald Trump being on the ticket. And so that, in some respects, even though was used as an answer or a justification or a rationale, could raise some really important questions for the future. I want to turn it around and say just the opposite, and that is we recognize that in certain places in the country, there is great admiration for Donald Trump. There are other places in the country, and these states represent that, in which there's a great disgust or disagreement with Donald Trump, and there seemed to be what many people are calling an unrelenting Democratic message linking every Republican on the ballot to him. You can find a lot of this in this very good piece that came out by the editors of the National Review, and it's just a reminder again that he is a polarizing figure in some ways. People that like him really like him usually, and people that don't like him really dislike him greatly. And the reaction to everything from the tariffs to the big beautiful bill and the issue of taxes, the question about ICE in the streets and deploying the National Guard, all sorts of things which many people that are listening to Point of View today applaud and are appreciative of. There are just as many individuals perhaps who would disagree with that, and that gave them reason enough to want to actually elect some of these individuals, including this individual, the Attorney General Jay Jones, who made some very loathsome comments, to put it mildly. I'm even today reading some commentary by some liberal columnists saying it just shows that you can wish your opponent to be killed, your children to be killed, and still get elected in a place like Virginia. I think that's an overstatement, but it illustrates again how that was not as much of a concern as people thought that it might. But let me just real quickly mention that Proposition 50, which I mentioned before. We have always said that even gerrymandering is a bad idea, but especially mid-decade gerrymandering is something that needs to end. And, of course, now you've had Texas doing one thing, California doing another, now a number of other states, red and blue, doing it. And I think this has gotten out of hand, and it's maybe a reason to have the Supreme Court rule in, and they're going to weigh in on this whole issue and ruling on the issue of the 1965 Voter Rights Act, but maybe in the process could also make some statements about whether or not mid-decade gerrymandering is constitutional. But the real takeaway, which we've been talking about for weeks, so what can I add that we already know? Zohran Mamdani is, again, an individual that won a three-way race in New York. It really wasn't ever close. I remember even yesterday seeing some polls that I believe were going to be accurate, putting him up by 14 points. And, of course, we see that he won. And yet everybody who voted for him knows indeed that he is a socialist, that he is going to work as hard as he can to change a lot of policies that have existed in New York City for some time, and as a result also is a Muslim, and what that might mean in terms of the way in which the Muslim community is welcomed and in some respects given preference. We'll see how that all plays out, but we are going to see just the very beginnings of what that might mean. And, of course, as many people have said on our roundtable and just in various conversations we've had with various guests, if he becomes the face, if you will, of the Democratic Party, Zohran Mamdani, if he is the face of the Democratic Party this time next year during the midterms, I don't think you're going to see the big Democratic night that you saw last night. But that's why we have elections, because you can never be sure. But that one looked like it was going to happen, and it has. And now the reality will sink in, not only to the individuals living in New York City, but to other Democratic candidates. Do they run with him or run against him because of his high visibility? And we'll be talking about that, as you might imagine, every single day here on Point of View. Let's take a break, though. I thought it would be good for you to hear a little bit about what is happening in this area of the country through Passion Radio Network. So we'll cover that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A recent YouTube video describes a pattern in history that has destroyed three global superpowers in the last 500 years. They were Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Today, the U.S. is following a similar pattern. In 1590, Spain was the richest empire on earth. Spain controlled half the world's gold and silver. Spain's military dominated Europe, and their currency was accepted everywhere. Yet within 80 years, the Spanish government was bankrupt. In 1914, Britain ruled the largest empire in human history. At the time, it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency, yet within 40 years, the empire was gone and the currency collapsed. In 1991, the Soviet Union still seemed dominant. It was another superpower. It had nuclear weapons, global influence, and satellites spanning the globe. Yet the Soviet Union ceased to exist 900 days later due to an economic implosion. The idea that nations follow a pattern as they collapse isn't new. Decades ago, I did a week of radio programs on the decline of a nation. A decade later, I did another week on when nations die because of a book that was published with that title. Recently, I produced a booklet, A Biblical View on Historical Cycles. What is new is how this video explains the 7 stages of collapse and applies them to previous empires. But the key point of the video is the reality that America has already completed 5 of the 7 stages. We aren't approaching the pattern, we're within it. As I often suggest, we can resolve some of these issues, but the first step is to admit that we are following this pattern of collapse. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, and I thought for just a few minutes we might learn a little bit more about New Mexico and Farmington, New Mexico, and the Passion Radio Network, and then we'll get into a couple of issues, one about AI, another one about Bill Gates and the issue of climate change, and a couple other issues, plus my commentary today about the collapse of civilizations. But I thought we would bring to the microphone Farid, who is the general manager of Passion Radio Network, and this is quite a network, isn't it, in terms of all the different radio stations?
Yes, it is. God truly blessed us. It was back in 1988, I think, when we prayed and said, Lord, give us the chance to become owners and founders of a radio station just for 1 year.
Yes.
Just 1 year. And the Lord has truly blessed us. This is we're about to celebrate our 38th year.
Yes. And again, I think you've had the point of view almost since the beginning, if I can remember right. And
yes,
so,
I remember.
When I say Marlon Maddox, yeah.
Yes. Marlon is quite he's quite a hero to me. He was such a great man and a wonderful broadcaster, and I looked up to him, and I think it was one of the NRBs that I saw Marlon receive. Is it the Lifetime Award? I believe it was. Yeah, and I was very impressed. That was my night.
That is very good. People might wonder, with the name Farid, you're Egyptian. And one of the things I love is in the studio here, you've got some things you've done in Egypt. And, of course, we had Dr. Merrill Matthews just went on a trip to Egypt and may have even used the same individual as the tour guide as you've used. And then you've got stuff from HCJB World Radio and all sorts of other things. But give us the extent, because even though you're in Farmington, New Mexico, I've been
talking to people in Colorado and other places that hear these various stations, and you have music stations, talk stations. Talk about that.
Yeah, we have about 30 signals in the Four Corners.
Yes.
The Four Corners is Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. And we have translators and signals in all 4 states. We also stream on the internet, passionradio.org.
Yes.
And the Lord opened up a door for us about 8 years ago, where my cousin then, who since then has gone home to be with the Lord, and I really admire my cousin so much. His name is Samer, and he opened up the door for us in Egypt. He said, "Can you help us start a Christian radio station?" Now, you can't have Christian radio, AM, FM, shortwave, all of that, but they don't know what to do with the internet. So he said, "This will be an internet radio station. Would you help us get started? You already have 3 radio stations and a bunch of translators. You must know something about it." Yes. So we flew to Egypt, my wife and I, who we were just young kids, just married a few years, for about 4 years, when we started the ministry here back in 1988. And it was her parents that have said to me, we're going to give you all of our retirement money just to get the radio station started. And she worked as a nurse for the first 5 years. Of course, no salary for anybody for a while until we could generate some revenue. But anyway, long story short, we want to fast forward to about 8 years ago, about Egypt. We have now 2 Christian radio stations in the Middle East out of Cairo, Egypt, streaming on the internet. And one of them is extremely popular because there's a popular group, Christian group in Egypt, sort of like the it's like the Maranatha Singers and like that. They're similar to that, and they're called Better Life. They get their name from John 10:10. I give you life, and I give it to you abundantly, or I give it to you better.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that station and another station that reaches all these people in North Africa and the Middle East called C'est La Vie Radio, radioclv.org, and we partner with them. They pick up certain programming from our network, and so we join together doing certain things.
Yeah. Well, I think that's just wonderful. And of course, I've chatted with Michael Yosef about what's going on there, and we just talked about Israel with, of course, Michael Rydelnik, and here you're talking about Egypt.
Yes.
But since we're in New Mexico, I wanted to make sure I didn't forget, you have a Navajo outreach. And for our listeners around the country, of course, this is where you have so many Native Americans, and I thought you might speak to that issue, too.
Oh, yes. That was one of our favorite programs on the air is the Navajo Hour. We have an hour on the air. Her name is Alice Norton. Everybody knows Alice. She's past retirement, okay? And we tell her that. She's past retirement, but she keeps going for the Lord, and she does such a wonderful job. It's an hour in their native tongue. She ministers to her people. She gets to speak at many churches, Navajo churches, and we just absolutely love Alice and the Navajo Hour, and God has just planted that seed. I believe it was 6 months after we went on the air. Alice walks in the door and she said, "I understand you're a brand new radio station. Can I join you?" And I sat down, and the rest is history.
Yes. Well, we do have occasionally a phone call from somebody that's a Native American, and I just appreciate that outreach that you have here.
Oh, praise the Lord.
And it's just very, very significant.
Yeah.
But just before we wind down here, I just thought I might say you have been so willing to carry point of view for so many years, and in some respects, there are other radio stations that say, well, I don't want to get into all that controversial stuff. We'll just play music, and you do have a music station. But talk about maybe the value of what we are doing, because you have been a partner for so many years, and I certainly appreciate that.
I think the first word that comes to mind is clarity. when we listen to Point of View, and by the way, you probably don't know this, but we have like half of the day call-in programs like yours. You are the number one person on the radio station, including the Bible teachers that we have early in the morning, beginning of the day, and people just call up and tell us how much they appreciate Point of View, how much they have learned, how much they have spiritually grown from Point of View, and they always attach it, Kerby, with a little bit of a warning. They say, don't you ever take that program off the air.
Not happening anytime soon, for sure.
Yes.
Well, listen, we can talk about the people around the area. First of all, I've got to say I'm very impressed with your wife. I mean, her academic background, her work as a nurse and everything, but you've got a pretty good staff here, and you've had them for quite some time, haven't you?
Yes, we have. As I mentioned, Alice, we've had her this is her 38th year coming up. Our volunteer engineer, Charles Rash, who has been with me, 30-something years. We've got Heather and Amy, and we're a small staff, but
Sure.
we do a lot for 3 big, powerful radio stations and 20-some translators, 30 signals, and the Lord does it all. He just uses us if we're just willing to do it, and we are.
Yes. But again, tomorrow I'm going to be in Durango speaking to some people there. I was in Pagosa Springs, and I met some people that came up here who listened to the station. So you may be small, but God has given you a pretty sizable megaphone in terms of reaching so many individuals.
Praise the Lord. Yes, He has. And I remember many years ago when I was a child, you're probably the same way as I am, Kerby. When I was about 5 or 7 years old, I just dreamt of being on the radio. My dad was a pastor, a Christian pastor in Egypt, in a very small town where there are cobras, snakes, and stuff.
Wow.
I can talk about it all day, but I know we don't have time. But I tell you, the Lord has been really good to us, and He has blessed us, and we want to bless not only the Navajo people, the rest of the community. We want to go overseas to Egypt. We partnered with HCJB. I mean, there's a lot of activity and history in the last 30-some years that we've been here.
Well, I'm just glad that I got a chance to meet you, because I know as we get older, we don't travel to NRB conferences and things like that. And
Yes.
so I was hoping you could come to us, but I'm glad we were able to come to you and to see your
The
facility.
honor is ours. Is mine. The honor is mine. The honor is mine.
I remember talking to you years ago about saying, you got to come out here sometime so you can go fly fishing, and you actually made that happen. So
Yeah. Well, and it was really interesting, too, because we announced to everybody that you're coming to town and to give you a Four Corners welcome. And I called, who is now a friend of mine. I didn't know him before, but he's been supporting the ministry. First thing he said, Fareed, Kerby is coming to town. He was all excited that you're coming to town. And that's when the whole thing started about him doing fly fishing with you.
So I think Warren Kelly and I will go out on a boat. I don't know what we'll catch, but we'll have some fun.
Well, you have fun, and thank you for being with us, and thank you for recognizing us. You don't have to do that. We're truly blessed that you are part of our ministry here.
Well, let's take a break. We have a few more things to cover. We'll be back right after this.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now. Be informed. Pointofview.net. Click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, broadcasting from Farmington, New Mexico, Passion Radio Network studios. It's been just a lot of fun to be with these individuals here, and we're looking forward to meeting some more of you tomorrow and over the next few days. And, of course, we will be traveling to other parts of the country, but it's just been fun to spend a little bit of time in the Four Corners area. Let's begin get to some of the other issues in the news. Of course, we could spend all day talking about the election, but there are other issues that are going to perhaps affect you even more significantly, and one of those is this article by William Galston. William Galston, if you're not familiar, actually worked in the Clinton administration. He is an individual who may disagree with us on a lot of theological issues, but I found him to be a fair individual, and his article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal, AI and the Coming White-Collar Political Upheaval. And then if I have some time, I do want to talk about my commentary today, which also talks about the collapse of empires. And both of these illustrate what's going on with the economy and what's going on with technology. And I think we need to pay attention to that. Christians sometimes have been a day late and a dollar short. Maybe how about a decade late and $1 million short on some of these issues, and we, I think, need to be on the front end of those. But one of the things that William Galston is warning about as an individual that's been looking at this politically is simply the fact that this remarkable change that's going to take place from artificial intelligence is going to be much more rapid than anything we've seen in other technological developments. We do have a booklet that I've done on various trends in society that we might come back and talk about next week when we can get into this issue a little bit more. But he points out that you see that articles about artificial intelligence, he says, which not long ago were relegated to technology and business sections, things that geeks would worry about, nerds would think about, are now making the front pages. Americans are realizing that AI can revolutionize the economy and with it society and politics. And he says, while this isn't the first transformation, hardly. As a matter of fact, I spent some time talking about those different trends and historical cycles that, matter of fact, that's the title of the book, A Biblical Point of View on Historical Cycles. Most of those took place fairly slowly. I'll get into that in just a minute. This one probably will be the fastest technological transformation we've ever seen. And since some of you have grown up with the technological transformation of computers, you might say, really? And I think the answer to that is yes. He points out, for example, that 4 of America's largest tech firms, that would be Google, Meta, Microsoft, and Amazon, 4 of the so-called Mag 7, now they talk about Mag 6 because I think they took Tesla out of it, are having capital expenditures over $360 billion just over last year alone. You have, of course, OpenAI, which has completed its for-profit transition and some of the things that it is doing there. And in some respects, when you are dealing with this, when large corporations and even this whole idea of industrial capitalism began to surge in the latter part of the 19th century, during kind of our industrial age, he points out that half of the nation's workforce was engaged in agricultural work. Now about 1.6% are. But moving people off to the farms into technology was a relatively slow process, and that is very different than what we're seeing right now with artificial intelligence. As a matter of fact, one Wall Street Journal headline announced last week, companies bet they will grow without hiring. What do they mean? How can companies grow without hiring more people? Well, in part, that's because the employers expect that AI will pick up some of the slack and they will be able to automate more and more. And if you think that that's maybe a wild, maybe example of hyperbole, maybe an over-exaggeration, look at the fact that UPS has reduced its management workforce by 14,000 in recent months. Salesforce and Microsoft have moved in the same direction. I have a commentary just came out on that particular issue. And you also are starting to see that even the Amazon in June, Amazon CEO said expected to reduce his company's corporate workforce because they're getting much more efficient gains from AI. It turns out, as I've pointed out before, that oftentimes AI is brought in to help a worker,
and eventually AI is able to replace that worker. And so that is, I think, going to be something to think about in the future. Let's put that in some context real quickly, and that is when we saw the loss of 5.7 million manufacturing jobs between January 2001 and January 2010, basically a 9-year period. That's what fueled what today we refer to as the Tea Party Revolution, and also, in many cases, I would have to argue, set the stage for Donald Trump winning in 2016. So AI has certainly had an impact. It has been positive for the people that are owning various companies, but it hasn't been so good for some of the workers. And so just as before we take a break, let me also point you to something else that we're watching, and that is the fact, and I quote from this YouTube video, in which it's been looking at how these various empires have collapsed. 1590, Spain was the richest empire on earth. Spain controlled half of the world's gold and silver. Spain's military dominated Europe. The currency was everywhere. Yet within 80 years, the Spanish government was corrupt and really very insignificant thereafter. 1914, Britain ruled the largest empire in the world. At the time, you might even remember from your history books that it was said that the sun never sets on the British Empire. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency, yet within 40 years, the empire was gone, the currency collapsed. Then in 1991, the Soviet Union was still seemed dominant, but we did see, of course, the Berlin Wall coming down. It was still a superpower. It had nuclear weapons, had global influence, it had satellites spanning the globe, and yet within 900 days, the Soviet Union as an entity ceased to exist. Yes, Russia is still there, but I think it illustrates that when you look at this, we over many years have produced, for example, weeks of radio programs on things like the decline of a nation. Of course, I just mentioned my booklet, A Biblical View on Historical Cycles. And when you look at those 7 stages that these empires went through before their collapse, you see that if you were to line them up with the United States, we are at stage 4. So we're no longer just looking at the possibility that this might actually happen. We're not just approaching the pattern, but we are within it. Now, you've heard me say this before, and I'll continue to say this, that we can resolve some of these issues. There are answers to these issues, but we can only resolve them if we're willing to admit that we've got a problem. And there has been, I think, a tendency, as we've pointed out before, to talk about the fact that, well, the stock market is really high. Yes, the stock market is high. For people that own stock or they own assets, yeah, it's been a good time for people that own scarce assets, and that could be gold and Bitcoin, or it could be various portions of land. It could be various collectibles that are valuable, or pieces of art, or whatever it might be. But it hasn't been so good for everybody else who's, in a sense, living on this hamster wheel of trying to come up with enough money to pay for gas and groceries and rent. And it seems to me that this is a reminder in this particular article about how other nations have collapsed and how the United States is right now still having the reserve currency. Whether it will continue is a big question, and how the United States will have the kind of influence that it is having right now. Because you really are getting down to the point of China and the United States. I mean, not ignoring Russia and the war between Russia and Ukraine, but you are seeing the opportunity for this country to make the right decisions and go the right way. But at the same time, we have to pay attention to that. And that's one of the reasons why, again, we produced a biblical view on historical cycles. And if you're interested in that, I'm sure we could get you a copy if you would like. But more importantly, it's something we're going to be talking about a lot more here on Point of View. We recognize that some of these technological changes like AI, some of these historical transformations that we've seen in the past, which are now taking place before our very eyes, and some of the economic challenges are ones that we as Christians need to be thinking about. So expect to see more and more articles about that. As a matter of fact, as a preview, many of you probably have already received our Outlook magazine, which talks about everything from the Federal Reserve, and even a year ago we did one on the whole issue of the national debt. These are topics we'll continue to talk about, even if they aren't being talked about by various members of Congress, maybe not even in your church. We think they're important because they affect you day to day. Let's take a break. We'll come back with some final comments. Bill Gates gets mugged by reality. That coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, just for a few more minutes, broadcasting today from Farmington, New Mexico. And just before we get into this piece by Bill Gates, a couple of announcements. First of all, on the program tomorrow, we'll have the Next Generation Roundtable. And so you had a chance to hear from Chelsea and Liberty and some of their guests. Just going to be a great set of interviews that they'll be doing 2 hours of tomorrow. So I would encourage you to do that. For those of you in Durango, I'd like to see you face-to-face. We're going to be at the DoubleTree at 1:30 tomorrow. So we'll be driving up there and looking forward to seeing you. Want to share some of the things that we're doing here on Point of View and also get a chance to meet you, shake your hands, and spend some time with you as well, because that is just a great opportunity. Again, I want to thank, of course, the radio network here, which actually have a station up there. And so those of you listening on Passion Radio Network, if you're in Durango, come out and see us. We would love to see you, and that is going to be a great opportunity. I'll be there. Jana Wilder will be there. Of course, Warren Kelly. I mean, you're going to get to meet 3 of the individuals that are part of Point of View, so I hope that you can make it possible for you to join us. Let me, just for a few minutes, and I do mean just a few minutes because we're kind of winding down today, mention that last week I talked about the fact that Bill Gates, of all people, again, this is the founder of Microsoft, an individual who oftentimes we tend to be relatively critical of, nevertheless has been changing his tune, and this is coming at the fact that the climate change conference is happening next week in Brazil. So he has become the skunk at the party, as you might have imagined, because he argues in a memo that he posted late October that although climate change will have serious consequences, particularly for people in poorest countries, it will not lead to humanity's demise. He says it's time to get rid of this doomsday outlook that he has presented. And so I took the time, since we have already talked about this a few times, to post this article by Stephen Moore, because Stephen Moore says Bill Gates gets mugged by reality. And here again he says how he rejects the doomsday predictions of most of the extreme global warming prophets. Some people said he shifted it because he wants to invest in these energy-intensive data centers, but whatever. Let's just give him credit where credit is due. Stephen Moore, I love this, says, what Gates has done is courageous and praiseworthy. There are not many people of his stature who will admit that they are wrong. Al Gore certainly hasn't. He says, my wife says I never do. So, again, he's recognizing that as well. Now, he still endorses this idea of communal action, which Stephen Moore says won't work, trying to get individuals to work there. But he's now been labeled as a traitor. They kind of pushed him out of the climate change tent and all of the rest. And he says, I wish to highlight several critical insights that should have been the starting point. In one, he says it's time to put human welfare at the center of our climate policies. He says countries should be encouraged to grow their economies. And although climate change will hurt poor people, it is not the biggest threat. Well, that's very good, but I think he also came to this conclusion because, if nothing else, he wrote a book a number of years ago, and I took the time, even though I had some people raise an eyebrow when I said I was reading through cover to cover Bill Gates' book. I was convinced that it was, in one case, trying to make the case for trying to deal with climate change, and at the same time acknowledging that this was going to be a really tough slog, because the title of the book is How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. Okay, so far so good. But as you started reading through, and as I took the time to read every page, every word on every page, by the time I got even really to the 4th chapter, I said, really, he should have titled the book, the subtitle, because the subtitle of the book was The Solutions We Have and the Breakthroughs We Need. And as you start working through there, yes, we have some breakthroughs, but most of those still aren't there. And even though he's not necessarily a scientist, I've got enough science degrees to be dangerous, and I was recognizing that some of the breakthroughs he's talking about would require maybe a change in the laws of chemistry and physics, and it just was not going to work. And so if you were going to try to accomplish the goal set down by the Paris Climate Agreement, you just were not going to get there from here. And so it's interesting that now he's talking about the fact that we should be concerned more about human welfare and that kind of action than being concerned about changing the temperature. And that the chief goal, he says, should be to prevent suffering, particularly for those in the toughest conditions who live in the world's poorest regions. We should measure our impact on human welfare, not impact on global temperatures. So, again, as I've told you, we posted this piece by Stephen Moore, and he gives credit where credit is due for kind of the 3 foundational principles of this memo by Bill Gates. But let me now quote from Stephen Moore some things that should have been added as well. And the first, he says, is the solution to changing temperatures and weather patterns is technological progress. Okay, in some respects, I'll give partial credit to the fact that Bill Gates mentions some of that in his book, but does not mention it in the memo. And if nothing else, we are finding that Bill Gates is starting to sound a little bit like Bjorn Lomborg, who's known as the skeptical environmentalist, who points out that the percentage of people who die of severe weather events today has dropped precipitously, and the number of people who are still at the level of extreme poverty are shrinking every single day. So the first thing is certainly to recognize that we have some technological changes that need to take place. But also the second one that Stephen Moore points out is to recognize that energy is the issue. We had Don Buckingham on a while back. Of course, we've had Dr. Merrill Matthews on. We've had a variety of others talking about how important energy is. And Stephen Moore says, look, to deny people reliable and affordable energy is to keep them poor and vulnerable, and this is inhumane. If Gates were to direct even a small fraction, he says, of the foundation funds towards ensuring everyone on the planet has access to electric power and safe drinking water, it would do more for humanity than all the hundreds of billions of dollars that governments and foundations have devoted to climate programs. And so again, as encouraging as it is to hear some of the things that Bill Gates is talking about in terms of climate change, maybe this will tone down some of the statements that are being made right now at this climate summit. But nevertheless, I wanted you to know that there are other things that we can and should be doing if we're really concerned about the future of people on this planet. And so let's give at least credit where credit is due. Bill Gates was willing to say something that says that we are probably doing a disservice by suggesting that we're headed towards this climate apocalypse. And back to the conversation we had even recently of Zoran Mamdani, some of the people around him, like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others, kept saying that we only have 10 years before we face this climate apocalypse. It's nice to see at least a few people coming out saying, yes, we do have a changing climate. Yes, we do have some things that we need to do, but we are not at the end of the human race. We're not at the demise of human beings, and maybe we need to inject some common sense even into the discussion about climate change. Well, that's all we have for our broadcast today from New Mexico. Again, want to thank those here that have made that possible. Want to thank everybody back in Dallas, certainly for the work that they've been doing there as well. Megan and Steve, thank you for helping, and even sitting across from me, Warren Kelly as well, because we are so grateful that we were able to bring this broadcast to you today from New Mexico. Enjoy the day. Join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.